everyone, and welcome. You're joining us for another great IANA webinar, Understanding Intermodal, the Basics. This webinar is brought to you by the Intermodal University, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we wrap up. But I'm really pleased to be able to welcome three great presenters that goes without saying that they're the cream of the crop. Shelley Austin, who is the president of InTech Freight and Logistics, Jeff Brashears, who is the dean of Intermodal University, and Rick Legore, who is the CEO of InTech Freight and Logistics. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to JB to get us started.
Thanks, Hal and Beth, and welcome to our Intermodal University session, which I call Why Intermodal and Why Now, hosted by IANA. Thank you very much for joining us all today. I am Jeff Brashears. Shelley and Rick shared their intermodal thoughts last year at the Intermodal Expo in Long Beach. It was so successful that Hal and Beth are bringing it to you today, courtesy of the Intermodal Association of North America. Shelley and Rick have been together for 20 plus years, working at Ingram Micro, and they worked at a number of third-party logistics companies, assembling logistics teams that brought together strategies that challenged the norms in the freight industry by combining all the things that they saw as buyers of freight service while challenging all the things they thought could be done better. In 2003, they started IDS Transportation Services and focused on supporting the IDS warehousing customers on the premise not that they would be the least costly, but rather they would be the best at what they did. In 2007, they turned their focus to domestic intermodal transportation. And in 2016, they bought out their warehousing partners to pull the transportation division out on its own where it stands today. Their services include intermodal, freight brokerage, outsourced managed transportation solutions, their Mercury Gate TMS solution, and supply chain consulting services. Where they have really shined over the years is through their innovative domestic intermodal transportation division. You'll find Shelley and Rick out on the circuit sharing their insights into how shippers can optimize their logistics strategy with intermodal, both door-to-door and ramp-to-ramp. Shelley speaks from an operational perspective, while Rick is focused on the financial market perspectives. Shelley comes to the party with a pure logistics and supply chain background, a bachelor's degree in business operations from Indiana Purdue University, an associate certificate in logistics and supply chain from the Penn State University. For 25 years, Shelley has been forging partnerships with key logistics leaders and is very well recognized in the industry. In 2013, Shelley was given the Rising Star Award by Progressive Railroading. She is actually now involved in TIA and IANA, NASTRAC, Mars, and NEARS. Rick, on the other hand, comes with a finance and business background. He received his degree from The Ohio State University, majoring in accounting, and has an MBA from Ball State. So he got one of the two schools correct while he was going to college. In 2005, Rick was named to the 40 under 40 list by the Indiana Business Journal, and over the past 30 years has held a number of positions in finance and logistics. I have known both for a very long time. Both exercise to the max their social media opportunities and contacts, and have built an outstanding intermodal and consulting group division. Without further ado, I turn it over to Mr. Rick Legore.
Thank you, Jeff. That was some really nice things. I really appreciate it. As Jeff said, Shelley and I have done this for a number of years together, and hopefully we can bring together at least an overall baseline and understanding of intermodal, so all of you that are listening in today have an opportunity to do the same. So we look forward to going through this, and then at the end we can cover some of the questions as they come up. So to get started, let's start in on the baseline about intermodal. So what we're going to go ahead and do to start off with, here's the map of the United States. And as you guys can see, these are the lines that are run for domestic intermodal. So on the West Coast, we have BNSF, and then we also have Union Pacific. On the East Coast, we'll call it basically coming down the Mississippi, is essentially the split. And then on the East Coast is where you have Norfolk Southern and CSX. And to be able to get from East Coast to West Coast and back again, not one single line runs all the way across the states, as you can see. So there are key points, with Chicago being the main one, of the place where freight is transferred from one railroad to the other railroad. But I wanted to show you this map for that reason, and for the other reason, which Shelley will get into a little bit later, in terms of wanting to involve multiple IMCs, and which we'll discuss what the different types of IMCs, because what you'll see is some railroads will hit some locations while other railroads will not. So when you're trying to figure out whether or not a lane works for you, you want to be as close to one of those ramps to make that happen for the business you're looking through. We'll show you a pie chart of both public and private box ownership. When people get into intermodal, they want to know who owns the boxes, who has the assets. And when you consider intermodal, it's not like truckload. Asset doesn't really mean asset in the same sense of the word, meaning that there is no, in truck world, the person owns the truck, they own the driver, they own everything in the process. On intermodal, there's not someone that owns everything. They don't own the box, they don't own the dray, they don't own the railroad. There's somewhere in that mix that they probably don't own something. So when you look at, when people say I'm an asset intermodal provider versus I'm a non-asset intermodal provider, it's not the same thing as saying I'm a truckload motor carrier and I'm a non-asset broker. So just want to make that designation first. But here on this chart, you can see the private boxes, and J.B. Hunt, we all know in the intermodal world, they're the 800-pound gorilla that when you're playing in the intermodal space, they are the one that owns the most boxes on the private fleet side. And that's illustrated on the left-hand side, where we have 194,000 boxes that exist out there today. When you go ahead and you look at the total U.S. fleet, there's right around 292,000. And when you take a look at it, you'll see UMAX, EMP, those are the ones that are owned, those boxes right there are owned by the railroads, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX, those are all within that box. And essentially, the railroads own about the same number that J.B. Hunt owns. And then you can see all the other folks out there that are in it also own boxes themselves. That's important as Shelley jumps in on the next slide to talk about the differences between the different intermodal marketing companies.
Well, I appreciate everybody listening in today. Rick gave a good baseline and start where we're at. And this is kind of like we're kids in a candy shop here talking about the things that we love. So hopefully everybody's going to enjoy the webinar. I want to talk a little bit about general basics of terminology. So in our world in transportation, I think there's an acronym for everything. And a lot of people will hear people talk about IMCs and what the heck is an IMC. So it's an intermodal marketing company. There's different types of IMCs, and people will kind of argue whether you're truly an IMC or not an IMC or a broker. So what we're really going to go through is we're just going to say who all kind of handles intermodal in our space. The first one that we're going to talk about is a bimodal. You'll hear people talk about bimodals, and examples of those, as you can see here, are like J.B. Hunt, Schneider, Swift, people that own a lot of what Rick talked about before. They own the equipment. They own a lot of times they own the truck, they own the container/trailer, and they're getting agreements with the rail lines to put those containers and trailers on the rail. So that's what a bimodal is. And the difference between, well, one of the things that you want to realize with a bimodal is you can't go direct to the rail lines, a shipper cannot, because they're a wholesaler versus a retailer. So in the IMC world or in the broker world, one of the differences is if you are working with a shipper, then a bimodal can go direct to that shipper if you're using them as your provider, but the rail lines cannot go direct. So that's one of the things you want to keep in mind. Then the next thing we're going to talk about is a non-asset IMC. So we kind of have this set a little bit weird here on the non-asset because there are some that we're listing that do have assets. It's kind of a combination, but one of the key points that you want to look at is ramp to ramp. So these folks are the large IMC providers out in the marketplace that have ramp to ramp rates with the rail lines. And they're out there purchasing the dray on both ends, working a lot of stuff behind the scenes. You know, intermodal is a very complicated mode, even though to a shipper or to somebody else, it looks like it just goes from point A to point B. There's a lot involved in the background. So on the IMCs, on the ramp to ramp, they have a lot of agreements with a lot of different dray carriers. They either use the rail-owned boxes, so the UMAXs or the EMHUs, you kind of see those going down the road, or they can go to a private provider like a hub or somebody in that nature that has their own containers. So some of the IMCs have their own containers and use the rail-owned boxes. So it's important to understand what the capabilities are of the providers that you're using on intermodal. Another provider, such as ourselves at Intech, we operate under a brokerage license, and then we utilize the door-to-door services with the rail lines. So each of the rail lines have a subsidiary where they offer door-to-door services, and they manage those dray networks as well. So those are the different types of intermodal marketing companies out there to help provide those services. So on the equipment types, we talked about the different types of IMCs. Now we're going to talk about the different types of equipment you can use to move the freight. So we've got the 53 domestic COFC or container on flat cars. This is, to me, is kind of the most common that you see on the road or that you're familiar with when talking about domestic intermodal. These are kind of what I mentioned earlier. You've got UMXUs, you've got EMHUs. There's all different types of them, but they're the rail-owned equipment. The weight that you load into these on average is about 42,500. People can load more or less. The issue is that you want to stay underneath what the legal weight is for the road. So it's not so much the issue on the rail, it's you still have to stay legal on the road. The difference in why you have to load a little less weight on a rail-owned or a container is because the container and the chassis are heavier than a standard trailer with its wheels. So that's why you want to load out a little less on a container. The next equipment that we're going to talk about are ISO boxes, or you hear them called international boxes. Those are the 20s, the 40s, and the 45s. I would say most commonly we see people load into the 40s these days. 20s can be a little bit challenging because 20s have to move in pairs. So you don't see people move as many 20s as you would see moving across the ocean. 40s seem to be a good box to move domestically when you're doing the repo program. 45s, they're in the mix, they just aren't as readily available. Then we talk about reefers. I think reefers are important to talk about because a lot of people don't think intermodal when you think about products, but there's a lot of reefer intermodal providers out there, a lot of capacity on that. It's growing every single day. It seems to be a larger service in regards to a good option for the temperature control, the temperature protect, and you would be amazed at the type of products that can move on a reefer intermodal move. The difference between COFC and TOFC on reefers, as you know, food products tend to be a little bit heavier. So there's kind of a competing marketplace out in the industry right now. You have to load less weight on a COFC. And so a lot of your products, a lot of your temperature controlled shippers don't want to use the COFC containers, but the price point is much lower. On the TOFC, you can load more, just a little bit higher on the price point. Rick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so now we're going to jump into what makes for a good intermodal lane. So I'm just going to walk through these four basic items. So one thing to look at initially is length of haul. And generally it makes sense when the lane becomes 700 miles or more. Anything under 700 miles, truck tends to be more competitive. Even at 700 miles, truck can be very competitive, particularly in today's market. But generally, 700 miles or more, 800 to 1200, it can be a coin flip as to whether or not you're going to find a better intermodal rate than a truck rate. And then really anything 1200 miles to 2000, let's call it 90% of the time, that's really a great intermodal opportunity. Jumping over to the dray side, so as Shelley said, there's ramp to ramp and there's door to door. Even in our services that are door-to-door services, as they're listed out and as we buy those direct from the railroads, there's still the overall operational side of it. There is still dray that's being done on both sides of the origin and the destination. And for intermodal to make sense, the closer you are to the intermodal ramp on your origin and your destination makes for more competitive rates. So essentially, we try to look at something about 50 miles or less, but as the length of haul does increase, you can get beyond 100 miles on either side of the line haul and still make intermodal very competitive. We're going to mention weight several times, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the presentation, but weight's key. So you want to make sure that the weight is 42.5 or less. And amazingly enough, that causes a lot of issues for a lot of shippers because they really want to load out to and expect intermodal to be exactly like truck instead of truck-like. Sometimes you can get yourself in trouble if you don't pay close attention to 42.5. And the last thing that makes which really helps out on the intermodal side is high value product. It's very difficult for somebody to be able to hijack the load at a truck stop or just grab the load somewhere out in the yard when it runs on the rails. The containers are essentially moving continuously. They're double stacked, so it's not easy to be able to get it on and off the well cars or even open. As a matter of fact, the container on the bottom, you can't even get the doors open. And then when they get into the intermodal ramps, those are surrounded by barbed wire fences, so people can't get in and out easily into those areas, which also, in terms of high value, also makes it a great option for Mexico. For those of you that move cross-border in and out of Mexico, you're very familiar with some of the issues that you have in terms of liabilities and being able to move products safely throughout that process. That's the baseline that we started from. Intermodal benefits. Many of you have seen this slide, and probably one of the reasons why you ended up joining in on the call is because you've seen all the benefits and you'd like to learn a little bit more. So I'm going to be really quick over this one, since this is something that typically gets talked about frequently. One, although doesn't get talked about frequently, is the scalable on the capacity side. So if you take a look at intermodal and the operational aspect of it, instead of having a driver drive, say, let's call it 3,000 miles, and that's only one driver on one truck with one trailer, in intermodal, you can throw a ton of capacity on an intermodal lane, because if you really think about it, you can have a driver turn multiple containers in that 50 miles from origin to the ramp, for example, several times a day versus one driver going all the way across the country. So that can happen on the front end, can happen on the back end, and then you've got a train that can go ahead and double stack the containers. That makes for a tremendous amount of capacity and ability to throw that capacity on any given promo, seasonal peaks, or even just regular standard business that you have. Cost efficiencies, on average, have been 15 to 18%. I would say that's not the case right now, but that's typical when under normal circumstances. Reliable and predictable. A lot of people don't talk about this as being a benefit, because a lot of people think, well, I lose trackability. And from experiences that they may have happened, 10 or 15 years ago, they have experiences that they share at the water cooler that says, hey, intermodal isn't that predictable and I've got all these kinds of problems. That's really not the case. The railroads run a very, very tight schedule, and they're very predictable on that. The areas that if there is an issue on intermodal, it isn't the line haul segment that the rails have. Typically, if you're having an issue on intermodal, it tends to be either on the front end dray or on the back end dray. And those are the areas that you really need to manage the tightest to give that 98.5%, 99% plus type service ability to your clients and your customers that you're serving. Security, we just covered a little while ago. And then environmentally responsible, those are some stats for your next Trivia Pursuit night. After that, we're going to jump right into some of the common misconceptions. On the misconception side, here are some of them, and Shelley's going to go over them in more detail. So slow transits, high damage and loss. We just talked about unreliable services, complicated work, lack of visibility, limited supplier operation or service providers. And a lot of people, we have to go into big box retailers. We do it today for a number of our customers, but a lot of people think that intermodal isn't a good option for retailers. These are all common misconceptions that Shelley's going to go ahead and jump in and walk you through each one of them in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so we talk to a number of customers all the time, and they get very shocked in regards to some of the things that we tell them about intermodal. One of the largest ones would be the transit time. Now, there are some longer transit times when you're interchanging, East Coast to West Coast, but think about Midwest to West. Those transit times are, almost equal to truck, not truck plus 1 day. And so that gives you an opportunity to really use intermodal efficiently and effectively in comparison to truck. especially when the truck market gets tight. This is when you really want to make that play for making sure everybody understands the transits for intermodal and how competitive and comparable they can be. The other thing that we like to talk about is regarding the transits over the weekend. So, I mean, it's funny, you can ship something on a Friday and it'll be ready for delivery on a Monday, and people don't even know that went, and they're shocked that it went intermodal. So it's very impressive to look at the differences between the transit times, and all of the rail lines are very, very helpful in getting that transit time information to you. The other thing, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is making sure that you have a good TMS that can hold those rail schedules and understand those transits to make sure that you're effectively setting up pickups and deliveries to make it a very good and efficient and reliable service. So as we continue to go through the misconceptions, I know that a lot of people, including myself, when I started in the industry, I said, I don't want to use that slow boat to China service that damages everything. Well, I was proven quite wrong. It became one of my favorite things to work on and to be a part of in the intermodal industry. So a lot of people have misconceptions that there's a lot of high damage and loss, and that you can't put very high value electronics or those types of commodities on the rail. It's not the case. As a matter of fact, all the rail lines are really good about their damage prevention groups and their quality control groups. And as long as you do a little bit of work on the blocking and bracing, which is required on the shipper side, to make sure that everything is blocked and braced well for the transit, then there's very little damage and loss within the rail lines. As a matter of fact, as you look at the word loss, it's a lot more protected. Rick made mention to the well cars, but if something's down in the well car, especially on some cross-border freight and such, and if it's going direct into Mexico and not stopping at the border, there's a lot more protection and safety on the product that's in those containers. In regards to the blocking and bracing, a lot of people think that it's going to be this huge ordeal and take a lot of time and money to block and brace, when essentially most of the time it's just a couple 2x4s and some penny nails, and you just secure the product to make sure that it doesn't shift in transit. As I mentioned before, the railroads will give you blocking and bracing diagrams. Your IMC providers should be a very big resource for you in understanding how to block and brace the product appropriately. The next thing we're going to talk about is lack of visibility. In our world, we actually promote that the visibility on our intermodal product is greater than the visibility on our truckload product. One of the reasons for this, if you have a strong TMS, is the TMS is only as good as the information you're putting in it. But if you have a strong TMS, you can fill it so full of good information and different types of checkpoints on these loads that it's amazing what kind of visibility you can offer to your customers. On the intermodal side of things, it's very impressive for us to be able to show the tracking and the tracing on the rail. We get different status points for every waypoint, and you can see those waypoints as you look into the system and see all the different interchanges through the rail lines. So as far as the visibility goes in the TMS, sometimes intermodal is the most visible of the products. One of the things that Rick mentioned on the misconceptions was the ability to go into big box retailers. A lot of the freight that we handle today, it goes into a Costco or a Walmart, or it goes into those locations that one would consider being a very limited and a very big issue with making on-time deliveries. And so one of the things that people fear from is putting this product on an intermodal shipment because they're afraid you're not going to be able to make those on-time deliveries. And we see that it's actually an advantage. As long as you plan it right, and as long as you know the rail schedules, you can get the product to the location quicker than if, for instance, on a truckload, if it were to break down in midstream, it's not as easy. But if once you get it to a ramp, you're within 50 miles of that delivery, and it's easier to plan and make sure the drivers are able to make that delivery very quickly. So we find it a benefit. The other benefit is you can have a lot of volume that you can push through to manage the volume shipments for the big box retailers. So it seems to be a very good, strong service, in our opinion, on managing into those higher delivery points and also the delivery criteria to making sure you hit those appointments. Now we're going on to understanding the need to knows. Rick, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'm going to go take this. I'm going to just go over to this next page. And Shelley, if you would go ahead and throw in some additional comments. I'm just going to read through these real quick, but as Jeff had mentioned to everyone, you are more involved in the day-to-day operations, and you can definitely give some examples of this stuff I'm just going to brush over. And that is, again, weight, 42.5 versus 45, very important to know. Blocking and bracing. We're going to have one more slide on blocking and bracing. That's the number one issue in intermodal is weight and the transfer of weight that can potentially happen within the line haul portion and what's called harmonic vibration on a railroad that doesn't happen in a truck. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. IMC's role in retail and wholesale intermodal market. That's something that Shelley talked upon a little bit earlier. Another thing to know is there's really three different types of pricing. You've got guaranteed pricing and capacity. You have spot rates that's out there, and then you also can get rates out there based off of short-term projects. So I'll just throw one up for an example. Say you're going ahead and special promotion that you have that's going to throw a ton of volume on a particular lane. You can get something on that. If you happen to be moving a warehouse from one location across the country to another location, you might want to go out for special project rates on that. Terminal storage and per diem, that's one of the big scares some folks have on intermodal, and they think that it's a revenue opportunity for the railroads. It really isn't. They really don't like to charge it, although sometimes it may feel like they do. It is not intended as a revenue source, and really it's their intent, as you saw, there's a couple 100,000 containers out there, and that they're using those to move all the freight possible that they can and find more modal conversions from truck to intermodal. So their key is those things are thrown out there to encourage and make sure that we're all paying attention and turning their equipment in a timely manner. So on the commodity front, there's most commodities can ride on the rail, but there are some prohibited and restricted commodities. Another thing to pay attention to are cut times. So from this perspective, when we're talking about what you need to know, there are specific times when the railroads are going to say, okay, this is all the containers that we can take at this point in time. If it's not in by this point, it's not going to be loaded and built into this particular train. It's going to have to wait for the next one. So it's important that you understand the cut times on the lanes. So when you're talking with your customers and you're saying, hey, this is going to be a 3-day transit, they need to know that it's a 3-day transit if you have it picked up by a certain time so that you can make the dray time to get to the ramp to get loaded in time. And then the other thing on that same side in terms of cut times is also review transits, because the majority of lanes move every day, but there are some lanes that if you're not careful, you're going to throw out a transit or expect a transit and the train isn't going to move, let's say Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, or some other schedule like that. So those are some of the basics here. Shelley, if you'd like to jump in, as I said, you have some very specific examples probably that you can share here.
I appreciate that. I would say, and we can probably fly past the next slide because I think I'm going to stay on this one and just highlight a few of the things that you spoke about, Rick. Blocking and bracing, I would say the one thing you want to really pay attention to there, I'm going to combine that one with commodity. So some of the commodities that we handle today that are sensitive to the rail lines would be like steel coils or aluminum coils. Those are very heavy, and they could, if not loaded correctly and blocked correctly, they could fall through the floor, they could shift, they could damage containers, they could cause a derailment. And believe you me, you don't want to get into a situation where you have a load that caused a derailment on the rail, because it's very pricey. Not only is it very pricey, but it's unsafe and detrimental to everybody involved. So it's very important to pay attention to the blocking and bracing and the commodities that you're shipping. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is we haven't talked much about what I consider to be the nemesis and the pains of intermodal, but it is a fact of life and something you have to be very cognizant of, is the chassis. Chassis can be, not too many people own their own chassis. So there's pools of chassis all over the place, and they're expensive and they're costly. And as we talk about terminal storage or per diem on boxes, one of the things that's very important is to understand the chassis. We've been in a lot of situations where I feel like chassis was my middle name, because that was the only thing that I was speaking about that day and trying to eliminate chassis charges or chassis challenges. But to just explain, each movement on intermodal, there's a container and a chassis more than likely if you're on the COFC product. And it costs it's a per day cost, and you have to be very efficient. So not only do you need to turn the containers for the railroads, and they're going to watch that and have that per diem out there just to make sure that it's efficient and turning effectively. It's the same thing with the chassis, because somebody owns that, they need it, and you need to turn it and make sure it's available for the next load. So I think those are some of the things that we want to highlight on this. And I would say that on the next slide, Rick, that we can kind of, we've really kind of beat the blocking and bracing and the weight to death. The only thing I'm going to point out here that I think is extremely important when we talk about weight, there is the 40-foot bridge law when you're shipping into and out of California. And so that's, a lot of times you want to be extremely cognizant of the weight when you're shipping a load into or out of California, because there's a little bit different on the specifics of what's going on there into that state. The other thing that I would mention is a lot of people get confused about, hey, my load was 42,300, but you're saying that I have an overweight load. Overweight means by axle. It's not, you can be overweight by gross, that's a problem, but there's also a situation where you're over on an axle. And again, that's illegal on the road if you're over on one particular axle, and you'll have to have it reworked, because the drivers who are under that load, they don't want to take the risk of getting pulled over and having an illegal load. So that's very important. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about was being creative with intermodal. And I think in this day and age, it's very important to figure, we've got everybody knows who's on this call, no surprise, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And we didn't want to spend this entire webinar talking about it, but I really wanted to bring it to light as to amazing things that people are pulling together, including our rail partners and intermodal and everybody who's all coming together to say, let's just figure out how to make this happen. And some of the things that I want to put out there is, some of our door-to-door providers like TDIS, they're offering over-the-road solutions with their dray network. So they're doing some over-the-road trucking that doesn't even touch intermodal with their dray network. Loop, the Union Pacific door-to-door providers, they're offering solutions to help with FEMA shipments and saying, hey, let's work together. Let's figure out how to make this happen. The railroads are providing solutions for, the retailers. This is a crazy time right now when people are shut down and they can't operate and they can't move freight, and everybody's working together to try and make sure that, they can't give stuff away and there has to be costs involved. But it amazes me in this time and age of how everybody's coming together and trying to figure out solutions to get the product where it needs to be, and also offer help and relief to the folks that can't operate in a normal basis like they have been before. So I think it's really important and extremely exciting to be a part of the transportation solutions in this time. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the intermodal product and how awesome it is. And now we're going to talk about how do you get started. So there's kind of two different ways. Let's just say, how do you get started if you're a freight provider? Or a broker, and I want to get into intermodal, or any kind of a freight provider that hasn't done intermodal before. How do you get started with it, right? So one of the things that you do is you evaluate the routes in the weights and the customer content that you're looking at. Is it good for intermodal? If it is, I recommend starting with the door-to-door providers. The reason I say that is you have to have a lot of business, a lot of intermodal business to enter into a rail contract with the rails direct. But you can go into the door-to-door providers, kind of an entry into the market, and they can get you started on intermodal. They can offer guidance, they can offer different types of ways to help you understand the intermodal product, and then you can start to build your business from that, and then eventually go into being a ramp-to-ramp provider with the rail lines as you grow your business. You don't want to put out the other options. So, door-to-door providers are kind of on your Union Pacific, your Norfolk Southern, your CSX, but the BNSF, they don't own their own equipment. So they don't really have a door-to-door equivalent of like what you have with the UP and CSX, but they have a lot of bimodal partners that can offer a lot of good solutions on the intermodal. So you just want to make sure you evaluate what lanes you're working on and which provider fits it best. Always understand your BCOs. So when somebody says a BCO, it's a beneficial cargo owner. And that's very important because the rail lines like to protect everybody. They want to protect and make sure that they can make it as competitive as possible, but also, they want to keep it clear. And if somebody's owning that business, they want to protect that business for them. So always know your beneficial cargo owners. And then you just establish the pricing with the rail lines. It's pretty easy. It's very quick, especially as you're starting up with the door-to-door providers. So I highly recommend reaching out to them if you have interest in intermodal. Rick, I'll let you talk about the next one.
All right, so that was the freight providers side of things. Let's take a quick look at the shipper side. A lot of it's similar, but some of it's a little bit different, so we'll just go through that. So first off, you'll want to look at your current freight, and you're going to want to look at what opportunities do you have to have modal conversion from truckload to intermodal. We talked about mileage, we've talked about weight sum, and then that's where you would begin to figure out, okay, which ones make sense that I could start engaging bimodals and non-asset IMCs. If you recall earlier in the presentation, there were two pretty important slides, and that was a look at the rail map and who had locations or ramps in certain cities, and then who owned the boxes. So it would be important to pull in bimodal, a combination of bimodals and IMCs as you're looking through that process. Because, for example, I'll just throw one out there that's real quick and easy. You pull in JB Hunt. Say you have a move that's going, let's call it from Chicago to Salt Lake City. If you look at the map, and I think you guys will have an opportunity to get this slide presentation, but if you look at the map, you'll see that BNSF or JB Hunt, they don't have a ramp in Salt Lake City. So for them to get there, they're going to have to go, let's call it to Los Angeles, and then they're going to have to dray it back. It's going to be very uncompetitive for them, or you're going to receive a very uncompetitive rate versus if you went to one of the other IMCs that work with the Union Pacific that move from, say, Chicago to Salt Lake City. That's something that they're going to be able to do, and they're going to be able to do it very economically because they have a ramp in both cities. And again, dray and how long the dray is establishes how competitive it's going to be for intermodal. So take a look at the information that you have. Go after the various bimodals and non-asset IMCs, and from there start to work with them. You'll have a baseline on, as I said, on miles and weight, but they also have some tools that they'll be able to throw into their systems to go ahead and identify other opportunities that would make sense on intermodal that may be not the norm or in terms of the general guidelines that we established earlier. So once you get through that, then you start to identify some solutions, you start to get some pricing together, and from that point, you say, okay, these are the lanes that we're going to go ahead and move on. But before you do that, you want to make sure that you engage your operations team to ensure that they understand that while the container has the same dimensions as a truck, it has different requirements in terms of loading it out to have that blocking and bracing to go ahead and make sure that that load is secured from origin to destination. And unlike truck, it's the shipper's responsibility. A lot of times shippers push the responsibility of that container or that truck to being in properly loaded out and making sure everything's okay. They push that on the carrier. That's not possible in intermodal. And if you really think about it, you really can't push on one person. And one of the reasons why, there's a few other reasons, but one of the main reasons is you've got three different entities that are going to touch that container before it gets to final destination. You got your dray at origin, you've got the rail, and then you've got a dray at the destination. And typically that dray at destination is not the same company as the dray at origin. So in any case, you want to establish the operations team so they know what an intermodal container needs to do and load out. A lot of them are going to, and I've been on the side to get up, oh my goodness, it's going to be so much time. And as Shelley said, sometimes it's a 2x4 and a few 16 penny nails into the deck, and then you're good to go. So once you get that taken care of, then what you want to do is on a few of the select lanes, don't go full bore. You don't want to go all in. Just go ahead, test some of the lanes, make sure that you're getting the performance on the lanes that you expected, work out any bugs that you may have in terms of communication with your IMC, maybe some communication that's not quite that you want to have running from the IMC's TMS into your TMS. Make sure that all those connections are working before you turn it on, because the last thing you want to do is tell your organization that, hey, I've got this great new mode that we're going to bring into our logistics strategy, and all of a sudden everyone has all eyes on it. And there's sometimes somebody that says, I tried intermodal 10 or 15 years ago and it was awful and it almost cost me my job. So in any case, you may have some naysayers out there. So put some test shipments on, make sure everything's working, make sure the communication is going through so your customer service, your salespeople can see what's going on. And then once everything it looks good on your test shipments, then absolutely go out there and turn it on 100% and start moving some freight. One of the things I did want to just make quick mention of it is, as you're engaging some of the IMCs, as Shelley said, there's the overall concept of BCO, beneficial cargo owner. There may be some IMCs that you start working with, and all of a sudden you say, I want to do something different, and you start looking at some other IMCs. Those other IMCs may not be able to help you out unless you get some communications together, because that freight is already considered operating under another IMC, and you're the BCO with that IMC. And the railroads are not going to go ahead. And one of the reasons for the BCO is they don't want to compete against themselves on price. So there might be some stuff that you might need to work through there if you want to change over your overall strategy. So with that, Shelley will jump in on pricing.
So, pricing is extremely important. I think it's one of the things that you want to get kind of creative or savvy at when you're looking at intermodal. What we see here on this slide is not what is current today, because these types of metrics change depending on if there's a market condition going on, such as what we have currently right now. So things can be fluctuating all over the place, but this is kind of a rule of thumb. So in norm, if there is a norm ever to be again, usually intermodal is about a 5 to 10% savings over truck. And so that's one thing you want to kind of keep in mind. And it really depends on the lanes, quite honestly. If you're going from a major ramp to a major ramp, it's going to be competitive to truck all day long. But if you get further and further out from the ramps, those longer dray miles are going to pull that competitive nature of intermodal away. So you really want to understand where your major ramps are. It's important to look at spot versus contract, because the rail lines are some of the most relationship-based providers that I've ever met. And so it's very good to understand that if you stay with them and you give them your freight all year round, they're going to stay with you when times change and when capacity gets tight. So on contract, it's very important to look at your book of business that you're working on for intermodal and understand, am I going to have this all year round, and is it going to be weekly freight all year round? If it is, I highly recommend going into a contract business, because when things get tight, then you want to make sure you have it on a contracted basis so you can make sure and get the equipment and you can keep your rate. Because the two things that happen is, if you're not on contract, when peak season comes around or something, a particular instance in the market changes and in the capacity tightens, the equipment goes away and the prices go up. So if you're operating off a spot, it can be a bit of a roller coaster. You can be riding the wave and making all kinds of money, or getting a really low rate and having all kinds of savings, but it's going to sting you on the on turn, because it's going to go up just as high as it went down when you're playing on the spot market. So understand what kind of consistency you have and fit the best type of price. When you're running through the RFP seasons, it's always best to try and get a contracted rate to make sure that you can protect the rates that you put in place all year round. All right, Rick, I'm going to let you talk about finding customers.
All right. Well, I'm going to keep this short because we're winding down here. So in terms of finding customers, there's a couple things to look at if you're a logistics service provider. One, look at your current customer base, look at your current freight, much like I was talking about the shippers. Look at the weight of that freight and the miles that freight is moving for potential opportunities to talk with your customers on conversion opportunities that will save them some money and bring some more capacity into their marketplace for them. Again, another place, I'm sure you guys are doing this, is that freight providers out there drive some of the heavily populated DC parks in your area, and you will see potential of just tons of trucks sitting in the lot. Opportunity is often screaming for intermodal to become a part of those operations. And another thing that we'd like to do, and at least on our part, is in a lot of cases, shippers are seeking us out, and the way that they are seeking us out is, as Jeff mentioned earlier, we are very much into the inbound marketing philosophy of life. And basically what that means is that we blog constantly about topics that shippers would be interested, or they're having struggles with their freight today, or they have questions about intermodal today, and they're trying to find that answer. And 9 times out of 10, if you have one customer that's asking this question, there's hundreds of customers or shippers out there that are asking the exact same question. And where do people go today to get their questions answered? It's certainly not the library and the Encyclopedia Britannica. At this point in time, it's Google. And so they'll go out there and search. If you would go onto our website, for example, which is intechfreight-logistics.com, you'll see that there's a learning center. You can search all kinds of different topics. And if you go out there and search on intermodal, you'll find all kinds of different things that we've written about in far more detail than we've even discussed here in this webinar today. But you go out there and again, you just continue to position yourselves as an industry expert, offering answers to questions. If you take a look, for example, at our blogs, if you want to use us as an example, our blogs are not rah-rah in tech. It's all really rah-rah intermodal and services. As a matter of fact, a number of them are top 10 articles on various providers out there. And so we're talking about our customer, or I should say our competitors, quite frequently. So in any case, because we want to make sure that we're providing the best answers out there on the web for people to come search. And a lot of cases, those folks come in and they're asking us and say, hey, I saw that you wrote something about this. Can you help us on this particular situation? So that's how we find a lot of our customers as well. So I just gave you our secret sauce, and maybe that'll work out for you. Hopefully it will. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff so he can walk through some of the questions that have come through.
Thank you very, very much. Hal, I believe you have some questions there with you, sir.
Indeed, I do. And first, let me say thanks to everybody. That was terrific. Here's a good one, and I'll try to distill it down. Basically, it's talking about the challenges that are going on and the differences between truckload and intermodal. But the core question is, what can we do as an industry to make intermodal the rule and not the exception when things get challenging or expensive?
So, Hal, one of the things that I'll say there is, I don't know so much about the rule versus the exception, but I can say, how do you make intermodal a consistent, not an every once in a while opportunity, especially when things get tight and the rates fluctuate as they do today. One of the things that I've noticed as intermodal continues to get close on the transit times, become a very effective and efficient service, is that shippers are getting smart in their RFPs. If it's an intermodal type thing, they're doing a very good job of making sure they commit to intermodal volumes, even if there's a difference in the rate at a certain point in time, because they know that it's a need and it's an additional capacity need that's not going to go away. So I don't know if I really answered exactly what your question was there, but what I see is that it's becoming a norm mode and something consistent for shippers to have in their book of opportunities versus, hey, let me just use it when the rates are good.
Makes good sense.
The other thing that we've got to add to Shelley's comment is that I think one thing that's changed a lot of, it's just about a capacity or pricing play. Precision scheduled railroading, as Shelley mentioned earlier in this presentation, has made a huge difference in service. Where service was once abnormal, I would say it is very normal and very consistent. And I think you see a lot more shippers at this point going towards intermodal as a daily transportation system, as opposed to, well, we just can't get any trucks, so we're going to go do this.
No, very, very good point. And actually, a question, Jeff, because I have a couple of questions that touch on scheduled railroading. So you kind of, I think you consolidated a lot of those into one really good answer. Here's a good question around reefers. Do the reefer carriers offer backhaul opportunities like some of the rails do?
So that's a great question, Hal, and I'll jump in there on that one. Yes, they do. And it's interestingly enough, it's not just backhaul opportunities for reefer freight. A lot of times it's for dry freight, right? Because it's a box. And although it has a special characteristic to it to be able to protect the temperature, It can also haul dry as well. So, you can get creative with reefer type intermodal solutions if things are tight and you just need an extra box for the capacity. But all the reefer providers, they're looking to keep those boxes moving and get them into the networks that they need. So they definitely offer opportunities for that. The other thing that I would say on that, Hal, is that interestingly enough, people don't realize that reefers are used a lot for temperature protect, not just temperature controlled. So commodities such as, plastics or wine or, any kind of beverages, those types of things, they use it for protect. And sometimes they use it for the heat aspect and not just to keep things cold.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Here's a question. Someone just wants a little bit more information. You mentioned opportunities for capitalizing on box repositioning. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you meant by that?
So I'm going to jump in here, and then JB, if you don't mind chiming in a little bit, because you're very familiar with, when I think of box repositioning, I think an awful lot on the ISO containers or the small boxes, because those are the ones that you really get some very good deals on repositioning the equipment in the spots where they need to be. Jeff, you want to add some of that?
Yeah, I actually think it's two things. The box repositioning programs from the Midwest to the West Coast that the steamship lines sponsor, which provide very attractive rates and very consistent service for people who have dense commodities. The other thing that we've talked about, obviously, in the past is Los Angeles is a huge outbound ramp and not a huge, compared to the outbound, not a huge inbound ramp. So working with the rails to find places where they have empty containers. Denver's a great example on the Union Pacific, to where they need empty containers. Los Angeles and Lathrop are two great opportunities for westbound out of Denver, which is a big inbound town, but not a big outbound town. So you really have two, the small boxes and the big boxes. Great question.
I think we can maybe sneak in one more question, and I'll throw in one on cross-border. This one is kind of a two-parter. One is, are there major things to be aware of with cross-border? And is the cross-border business with Canada, U.S., and Mexico, U.S. significantly different?
Yeah, so cross-border is huge. I would say there are differences between the going in, in and out of Mexico and going in and out of Canada just by nature of it. None of it is difficult once you understand the characteristics of it. Some of the most difficult that I found are kind of a multi-cross-border where you're going through Canada into the U.S. and then into Mexico, because there's certain things that you need to be aware of there. A lot of your rail partners will work with you. What I highly recommend when you're dealing with cross-border, specifically on the Mexico product, is to align yourself with somebody that understands Mexico, speaks the language, and can help, facilitate the conversations with the customs. Because I think that's where you get into the challenges, is making sure you understand all the ins and outs of the customs piece. As far as the movement and the protection of the product, it moves very well intermodally. Both directions. And so that's the one thing that I would say, is just make sure that you understand the characteristics before going into it. But once you get it set up, it works quite well.
That's great. Well, I wish we had more time. We've got more questions. We've got a lot more to talk about, but unfortunately we're at the hour. I want to thank Rick, Shelley, and JB for spending your time and sharing your insights. If you do have any other further questions for us or our speakers, go ahead and hit us up at intermodal.org or send us an email at info@intermodal.org. Or you can just send an email to hal@intermodal.org and I'll take care of it for you. Again, Shelley, Jeff, Rick, and take care, everyone.